I'm Susan Olexi. I'm a member of the Lyceum Committee, and this is one of our programs in response to requests from various people. And we're thrilled to see so many of you here, and I hope we'll answer a lot of your questions and inspire some of you. So let me give you a little perspective. Since 1973, the average size of a house grew from 1,500 square feet to 2,600 square feet. The square footage per inhabitant is 1,000 square feet, and in the 1930s and 40s it was 200 square feet. The threshold for a tiny house is 400 square feet. There's no single state regulation covering tiny houses on foundation or on wheels. Nevertheless, several communities have tried to move ahead. Nantucket has been allowed now to introduce tiny houses on the island. Lawrence, the city of Lawrence, is looking into building them as low-income housing for certain groups. And the YWCA Mass Build group in Springfield has already built 2 with a grant from Mass Mutual. So things are moving ahead. There is a sample zoning regulation, which there's information on that at the information table in the back. Our 3 presenters this evening know a great deal about tiny houses because all 3 live in one of their own. Each presenter will take about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So let me begin with introductions, and then each person will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll move over for questions. Joanne Baker is an avid naturalist and vocal environmentalist. With 2 friends, she created Inner Light Journeys in 2012 and leads 1 to 2 small group cultural immersion retreats in Peru annually. Joanne began her professional life in child psychology and education. Mid-career, she switched to architecture, a profession she continues to practice today. Both of her careers have allowed her to explore the ways our immediate physical environment shapes the way we live and work. She designed her 180 square foot tiny house on a foundation in Rockport. Isa Bauer is project manager and lead designer for Tiny House Northeast, a New England and Upper New York State tiny house business. She earned a master's degree in regional economic and social development with a concentration in sustainable development, including green building materials and construction methods research. She had her first tiny home when she was 19 years old, and the design team at Tiny House Northeast has 7 tiny homes between them. They specialize in design and building the tiny house with special insight into space efficiency design and challenges of the tiny house on wheels. Tracy Powell has worked in the design and construction industry for over 2 decades. She spent most of her life living tiny and spent much of her childhood living in RVs while her parents built larger and larger houses. A few years ago, Tracy designed and built her own luxury tiny house in collaboration with over 30 engineers and building experts. Her high-end, high-tech home has been featured on TV multiple times and toured by over 50,000 people. Her passion has become a mission to help others live simply, safely, and sustainably. So with that, I will introduce Joanne Baker, who will be our first speaker.
And can everyone hear me? Okay. I'm going to talk to you about the journey of getting from that 2,600 square foot house, or whatever size your house is, to a tiny house. Mine took me from my first house was a little Sears craftsman's cottage, and then it moved into apartments, and then a little neighborhood, subdivision. Then I found myself in the gardener's cottage in Corning, New York, and then from that a 13-room Victorian, followed by a move to Medfield and a 7-room expanded Cape that was about 2,400 square feet. From that, I sized down to 185 square feet. It was something that I did very intentionally and I did it over a long period of time. I thought a great deal about what it was I was trying to achieve by sizing down and what was important to me about my living environment. And with all the many moves I've had, which was 11 since I left college, every place I've moved has had a couple things in common. All have had environments that are filled with light, and all have had a deep connection to the natural environment. So that was the first basis for my move. When I turned 50, my kids were gone and I started traveling. But I didn't do Europe. I did Tibet and Nepal and Bali and Guatemala and Ecuador and Peru and several other developing nations. I was fascinated by the way the people lived there. In fact, when I came home from Peru the first time, my friends asked me, "How could you be in that place?" And my response was, they said, "Didn't the dirt bother you? Didn't those little houses bother you? Didn't this and this bother you?" And my response was, I came home feeling their culture and their way of life was much richer than mine, because it was not about things. It was about community. It was about friendships. It was about respect for the earth. And all of these things really are values I hold deeply in my heart. So it became a question of, how do I align the way I feel with the way I live? Which was a pretty sort of overwhelming undertaking when you are looking at 2,600 square feet filled with, in quotes, treasures. There were things from grandparents and great-grandparents, drawings from kids, leftover hockey sticks and ice skates, glasses that I kept because they were beautiful but too fragile for me to use. And I finally decided, okay, the first step was my attic. At the point at which I tackled it, I had lived in the house for 15 years. And when I walked in it, in the back of it, I found boxes yet not unpacked from the last move. Well, I didn't even open those. Those went right to the recycle center. Because if I hadn't needed it in 15 years, I surely didn't need it now. Then as I moved closer to the door of the attic, it was like going through a time capsule. The most furthest removed things from my current life were at the back of the attic. So I worked from the back forward, and before long, my attic was empty, but the local organization that furnishes and homes in Medfield for people who are coming out of homelessness or have been burned out with a fire or other natural disaster and they don't have any possessions, acquired a lot of dishware and old linens and well-loved things that we no longer used. Then came the cellar, which the people before me hadn't emptied. That required a dumpster. And there were the people who lived before me, he had been a plumber. So I had a lot of old pipes, I had broken tools, I had things, because it was a place I didn't go. The house was 250 years old and the cellar floor was like this, but there was a lot down there. There were also a lot of discarded things like old sleds, old sporting goods from my 2 boys, dartboards, weights, all of those kinds of things. So my life became like, and the cleaning process became like a reverse scavenger hunt. The question became, where do I find a new home for all these things? And I've put together a way to find those. The other things I would think about as I was looking at this is, do I own my possessions or are they owning me? And I began to feel like I was truly being held hostage by the 2,600 square feet that needed cleaning, the 2 bathrooms, the 2 acres of yard and trees, and the garage, another treasure place because it had a loft that got the unused rack for the car that carried luggage. It got windows that had come out, all of those good things. Some went to Habitat for Humanity. The bicycles went to programs which would provide them to children who didn't have them, or it would provide them to developing nations whose people could get to their jobs if they had a bicycle, but they could not get there without one. So that cleaned out the garage. And then I was gradually paring down what was inside. I looked at dishware. I looked at how much furniture we really needed. Before long, I'd pretty much cleared out the upstairs, and that became resident for a wonderful foreign exchange student who was with me through her associate's degree, her graduate degree, her undergraduate degree, and her acupuncture degree. And when she left, her things left with her. My den became my work-at-home office, and my bedroom, which was large enough to contain my double bed and a second one, became both my guest room and my bedroom. My kitchen became emptier and emptier, so I was moving out without moving out. And then the day came 10 years later when I sold my home. And the people wanted possession in less than 30 days. And I thought I'd done a great job until I began thinking about how that was going to get emptied and where I was going to go. At that point, as an architect, I had a folder about this thick of sizing down and right-sizing houses that started out at about 1,000 square feet and got smaller and smaller and smaller. And I experimented with renting a cottage that was furnished, that had 250 square feet in it, and that was too big. This is where I live. This is my home. My children take me by Home Depot and point to the sheds and say, "Mom, it's just like your house." But inside it's a little bit different. This is the total floor plan. Closet, kitchen, bathroom, living room, bedroom, and this is eating, storage for cookbooks, and it's an extra workspace in the kitchen. It's also my office. And then I have a sliding glass door here, which you can see here. Books stack up on the wall. The ladder leans against the wall, and above the bathroom, when the ladder comes off the wall, It fastens here, and when I go up, that's both my meditation space and where I sleep when I have a guest. And they get my bed downstairs. I gave away almost all my possessions. My silver I offered to my children with the caveat that what they didn't take was going to the recycle center. My dishes, most I kept place settings for 4. The rest went to the same organization that provides furnishings for people who don't have them. All of my things were very well loved, and it gives me great pleasure to think of them now in someone else's home, filled with that love and gracing theirs. And that's how I got from my big house to my right-sized house for me. I walked to the library, I walked to the post office, I walked downtown for coffee shop and meditation, and I've got a wonderful group of friends. My yard is manageable. My visual yard is much larger than the one I live in, and it feels perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. I have to say, I have been in Joanne's little house, and it's very comfortable, and you don't feel cramped. It's really lovely, and she's worked out, every little space. So it's quite wonderful. Next, we have Isa Bauer from Tiny House Northeast.
This is great to see this many people interested in tiny houses. I'm Isa Bauer, and Gloucester is one of my favorite places in the world. I started my life in Rockport and Gloucester and intended coming back permanently one of these days, actually. So it's really neat to just be hanging tonight with you. I have, as a design builder, custom design builder for tiny houses, it's both for static, on foundations and on wheels. It is a business. However, I'm here tonight, logo and all, but to provide the information about really the challenges in a very short amount of time that we have, more than anything, because it's not fair to let people get into this without having a really good idea about the big picture. And so I hope you don't mind. I'm going to be quite frank, and that's what I do at the presentation. So. I wanted to show you the first one. I have to get used to this ensemble here. Okay, so that I had to do a project on my own first before I forayed into any of this on a bigger scale. So this is a sleeper cabin. This is not a tiny house. This is what I use for. I do historical reenactments, and I bring this to our campsite. And I pull up, with this, and I unattach it, and I look out, and I see my friends who are setting up their tents in the cold at night, and a little bit disingenuously, I say, "Does anyone need any help?" No, everyone's very independent. Oh, okay. And I go in and I take a nap. It's wonderful. So this is all scraps. It was scrap shiplap and a used trailer and even some spare metal roofing. And by the way, we always use metal roofing on the tiny houses on wheels. It's light. It sheds ice and snow really well. It lasts longer than asphalt. All the good reasons to use the metal roofing, by the way. So these are just a few of the stages. We have the trailers, and then there's a finished tiny house. There's a shell, which is just sheathed, and an upstairs view of the loft. Upstairs, the loft. Now, I want to say that there's a huge difference between a static tiny house, one in a foundation and one on wheels, not just the wheels. A tiny house that's on a foundation has to meet building code. 100%. Okay? 100%. So the idea that you could remove, for example, your garage and replace it with a tiny house, and tiny house is arbitrary, but we'll say, 400, 500, maybe 600 square feet. If it's a static house, it's arbitrary. But, building code would mandate that, for example, any sort of living space would have a certain ceiling height. And not just a height, but a certain width at that height. Furthermore, the stairs would have a certain depth to the treads and the height of the risers and the stairs. These are all code things that can't possibly be met, by the way, on a tiny house on wheels. A static tiny house needs a frost wall, a very specific, foundation configuration, all of the electrical, the energy efficiency, et cetera, and down the line. Meeting that code is a quite expensive endeavor. And all of the permits for a tiny scale, be it 500 feet, let's say, 500 square feet, all of those permits and all of the preparation for the foundation, the excavation first, et cetera, would all be part and parcel of a static tiny house. So I want to clarify that, because this is the biggest, thing that people contend with. I mean, we get questions, hundreds and hundreds over the course of the year, about static tiny houses and what it can be and what it can't be. And the long and the short of it is, it needs to meet building code. So then we come to the tiny houses on wheels, and those can be configured in a couple different ways. First of all, if they're done correctly, then I'll get to this. But if they're done correctly, then of course they're meeting what we call life safety codes. So fire safety and electric safety, automatically we're going to do that by default. And then structurally we're doing some pretty interesting things. We've got a trailer as our foundation. So we're fixing that trailer, and the consequence of not doing that is kind of obvious going down the highway, but fixing that trailer with a lot of unique hardware, vertically, horizontally, there's all sorts of extra hardware that gets rather expensive, by the way, as are the trailers. The trailers themselves are intended to carry the weight of a stick-built building. So typically, against code here, 2x4 walls, not 2x6 walls, and maybe 2x6 in the ceiling and the floors. And then all of the other stuff that we'd have that's pretty ordinary in a typical house, actually. So the trailers are not RV trailers that have the building portion taken off the trailer and then reused. They cannot be. Another question we get dozens of times over the course of the year: can I use our camper trailer to build a stick-built tiny house on? No. The capacity of these trailers are for 7, 10, 12, 18,000 pounds of gross vehicle weight. These are very heavy buildings. Okay? So to that end, what you might see for bringing it anyplace else, for transporting one, at best, the leased vehicle would be an F-150. So no cars. Okay? So maybe at 14 or 16 feet, and by the way, that would be 8 by 12 or 8 by 14 or 8 by 16, maybe you could build it light enough to just use an F-150, a Ford F-150. I'm a little partial. That's what I have for a truck for me. And then after that, you really need a 1-ton truck. So guess what these really aren't doing? Traveling around. They're not traveling around. Now, to move this a couple times in its lifetime, or your lifetime, is not such a big deal. A few $1,000s later to take it all the way across country, for example, from maybe Massachusetts to warmer Florida, that's probably something that could be built into someone's budget. And that's often what people will think about doing. They'll park someplace where they can, and then, the idea is perhaps upon retirement, they'll go down south someplace. So why would we do the stick built? Because, well, for interior health, we can choose the materials. A larger environmental health, when something does go awry, we're not taking these materials and necessarily filling landfills with plastics and metals. Of course, there is some, but predominantly we're working with wood. Customizability is a big deal. Now, customizability, that happens to be my specialty, is working with people to get it just right. So we're talking about their hobbies and their lifestyle, disabilities, age, pets, how many visitors, etc., right down the line. And it makes for a very interesting customization. We haven't experienced two people yet, or two families yet, that had the same exact layout, the same exact needs. I'll give you a quick example. One person loves to cook. Typically, a tiny house on wheels doesn't have anything that resembles a full kitchen. So there's a 2-burner gas stove, and there's a tiny refrigerator. Maybe there's an apartment like this short of a refrigerator, but nothing full size, and no oven. Okay, but if someone loves to cook, we want to get all those things in there. It's their love, and going into it, like we were, you mentioned, you figure out what you love long before you make a decision for the tiny house. Now, on the other hand, if what you do is ski or you have sporting equipment, then you might consider that you'll want some tall cabinets, and perhaps if you have enough of the long stuff, that you just want to have it suspended over, in the ceiling. So that's something else that you could do. But these things really make a difference when you assign importance to every square foot. So I don't mean that you're using every square foot, but you're assigning importance to every square foot in this building. So what we have here is, just to give you an idea about some logistics here, on that image on the right-hand side, it's indicating that we have, for a tiny house on wheels that requires no special permit or license, we have a building that can't be any larger than 8.5 feet wide, okay? And if you want some of the roof to extend past the exterior walls, then you probably don't want the building itself to be any wider than 8 feet. And then when you think about the walls, the finishes, exterior, interior, the framing itself, etc., what you're left with inside actually for the width is about 7 feet. The length is a little more friendly, 40 feet long, but we don't build that long. I'm sure that somebody does, though. We typically go 24, 28. And there's reasons for every increment of a couple more feet of length, believe me, especially if there's a full kitchen involved, or if someone insists on having a washer-dryer, as an example. Or sleeping on the main floor. That also creates a longer building. And then the height is really critical, especially in our New England. 13.5 feet high. Okay, we can't go over that. So once somebody exceeds that 13.5 high, and I mean from grade, the ground, up to the tip of the roof, then there'll be special permits, and there's special mapping for professional truckers or tow people to know just what to avoid for our bridges and things. I know that we've got a couple short ones in Gloucester, actually, but I don't know if they're as bad as 13.5. Yeah, Storrow Drive, I heard, yeah. So when we're thinking about the design, we're thinking about, maximizing height, repurposing things, the size of things in general. We're taking all of that into consideration. I don't want to go too much into that because I don't want to elongate this portion of the presentation. Just as an example, real quick one, because you're making use of every square foot, you think about even how you use the stairs. So how many people here have seen the cable TV shows with the tiny houses on them? Like everybody? All right. We've been on a couple of those, like Tiny House Nation, Tiny House Hunters. Okay, so it's a very neat thing to have the staircase. When the building's long enough, you can try that, have a staircase, to put cubby holes or cabinets or drawers in the sides of the stairs, or maybe the stairs themselves become compartments. But you know what happens with that when you only have 150 square feet to work with? You lose space. If you leave that underside of the stairs completely open, then you have a flexible, much larger space, because as you add each slat of wood each panel inside to create those cabinets, etc., you're losing that much space that you don't want to in these tiny houses. So if you leave the staircase open, you put the Christmas ornaments at the low side and hang your long winter coat on the other side, and put your broom in that way, and it works out really nicely. Just as an example. So when we're thinking about space efficiency, that is our concentration. Then after that, we can think about the embellishments that help these buildings not only be beautiful, but fit in aesthetically into our New England architecture, into our environment here. We work out of New Hampshire. I live in Mass. But, we get that. And architecture is just an old love of mine and history. So, these embellishments that we could have would be shutters or fancy shaped windows. There's so many things that we can do with trim, even in the interior, that don't disturb the efficiency portion of the design. Or we can keep it really simple. And by the way, this is a lot simpler to build as well. If we're building with just a shed roof, this one pitch versus a gable, which are the two typically, they're the most popular, one of the two. This is very easy to build and a really great starter for the do-it-yourselfers here. And if we really want to make this slick, I've seen some great designs. Actually, we're working on one like now with lots and lots of and the windows can take up like a whole corner. So if you could picture this, the storage is great, but just to make this really neat looking, picture a whole panel of windows here and a whole panel of windows here and parking that in the mountains or something. That'd be neat. So now I talk about the poop. This is one of the most difficult parts of tiny house ownership, and the one that the towns struggle with the most. As soon as you are tying into the town's water, or you have a well and you're tying in permanently, or you're tying into the sewer or septic, you've said to the town, if you're in a tiny house on wheels, I just don't feel like paying real estate taxes. I'm sorry. They don't take to that very kindly. And that is a big issue. So when you hear that parking is a challenge, this is one of the main reasons it is. Policy will be slow to come to terms with not getting their real estate taxes. So maybe there'll be some compromises, and maybe they'll take a reduced tax, which would be great, and we're hoping for these things. Another thing is, very specifically, sewage management. Millions of people have died over the millennia. Is that a word? From the pathogens in poo. It's we know this, right, from history. I mean, millions of people. So the policy that has evolved as a result will not become less stringent over time. And it shouldn't. So now what a lot of people will have for toilets in the tiny houses on wheels would be composting toilets. That's the most popular one that we have. Our customers ask for this. And I use one. But I also have quite a bit of land. And this is how it works. You have a natural medium like peat moss, which is great. And you have, in its simplest form, you have a bucket. And someone carved out a tree trunk there, put a toilet seat on it, right? But you have a bucket, you put the peat moss in, and you do your thing, and you throw more peat moss on it, okay? And now you want to empty that every week or so, depending on the usage, out to some place where people aren't walking, obviously, right? And now this means treading through snow, perhaps, and dealing with this administration, at any time of year. And then further, it's really compost in progress, so it takes a couple years for it to be processed to the extent that now it is actually compost for a garden, and it's dang good compost. It really is. But it's quite a process. And the alternatives would be, for example, if there's an incinerating toilet that actually does just what it sounds like, it burns up all the waste, and then there could be an RV approach to this, not living in it full time, but outfitting the tiny house on wheels as though it were a camper, and outfitting it with what's called black and gray water tanks that would capture both the human waste as far as, feces and urine, and then the gray water being everything else, all the other wastewater, which is kind of a shame because we can use that wastewater, I think, in our gardens and all sorts of things. Quickie, American Tiny House Association .org. You might want to check that out. And we're ready to go for.
We're ready
okay.
to go with Tracy.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
But my name's Tracey Powell, and I designed and built my own tiny house. And like they said, I grew up in an RV, so I'm okay. I'm pretty functional. You guys can hang out with me afterwards or go out for drinks tonight, and you'll find out I'm not that screwed up. Growing up in a tiny little environment in a tiny little space, there was 4 of us in a 40-foot RV at one point, so you can imagine the tiny amount of square footage I had there. But I kind of want to put to rest something I when I was on TV, and nobody wants to say this on the TV shows and everything, but people have been living tiny for many, many years, hundreds and hundreds of years. You could say almost 1,000 years. And in Europe, most people still only have about a couple hundred square feet on average per person in the home. Now, I'm 150 square feet in my tiny house, and that's just for me. I think that's just enough room, 150 to 200 per person. I'll tell you why I think that in a little bit here. But RVs have been around forever, and caravans before that. Horses used to pull them around. Homes on wheels, since we came about and invented the wheel, this is not a new concept. It's just kind of cool right now, or it's a little bit of a fad right now, right? We have the trade shows. Anybody in here ever been in a tiny house before? Raise your hand. Yeah, a couple. Anybody live in a tiny house besides the 3 of us? Nobody's willing to admit to it. There's got to be a couple others here. Yeah. Oh, there's one. Okay. Yep. So usually. They say I'm actually a state chapter leader for New Hampshire for the American Tiny House Association. So you mentioned that. We're trying to accumulate a database of places that you can park tiny houses if they're on wheels or build them on foundations. So that's under development. But why are we seeing so much of this now? I have a couple slides always in the beginning about why, the cost of living and fuel. And actually, there's more single people like me, solo. I'm turning 40 this year, not afraid to admit to it. There's a rise in solo people that live alone in this country. And it's not unique to the United States. Even though our homes here are a lot bigger, over in Europe, there's a lot of folks that live alone. So what we do, what those of us in tiny houses actually do that's different is we prioritize, I think, our lives in a little bit of a different way. I used to spend over 1/3 of my income to live right here on the North Shore for about over 3 years. Before that, I was in the Boston area, then south of Boston and in Providence. And I spent over 1/3 of my income on an apartment, the ones that were right here on the highway in Peabody. You can see them when you go right through Peabody, all of those apartments up on the top of the hill. I lived in those for 3 years, and I was just throwing money kind of out the window, and I thought, I'm going to go buy a house. But there's, for one person's income, and it's not a tiny income, but I was finding that, it was the cost was going to go through the roof. So now I spend less than 10% of my still the same income, less than 10% of that on living in a tiny house. My main reason for doing that was so that I could travel more often. My priorities in life have to do more with having fun and travel, and I'm sure you have a lot of different hobbies than I do, but I'm able to think about that first when I get up and when I get my paycheck every month before I even think about, this tiny little amount of money I spend for a parking spot. And by the way, and if there's any claustrophobics in the room, anybody who's afraid of being in a tiny space, I invite everyone here at some point. You can take one of my cards or come up to me after. Come see my tiny house. Hang out there for a few hours if you want. I'm happy to give a tour to anybody. It's like one of my favorite hobbies. So, I have people come there all the time. But I think living in a small space may help you solve some problems that are fairly new developments in the psychology of humans over the last maybe 50 years or more. Our homes have gotten so big, we've acquired all these disorders, I guess you could say, or habits that are causing some real problems for people. People are going to therapy for this stuff. People are reading books about how to solve these problems that wouldn't exist if you lived in a small space and never accumulated a ton of stuff, okay? So I want to say, because, you know, with American Tiny House Association, it's important to understand, and she mentioned it's very, very true. There's a very huge difference between the homes on the foundations and the homes that are on the wheels, okay? If you build a home to code, and I've practiced architecture for about 20 years. I'm not licensed or anything like that. But if you build a home to code, you add up and you say, I need this amount of space when I step out of the bathroom. I need this width for my doorways. And if you add up all these numbers in the code for residential, the IRC, you come out to about a 400 square feet. Okay, once you start going over that, you're just adding extra square footage. But 400 is about as small as you can get, meeting all those current code requirements. Now, this past fall, has anybody heard of Appendix Q, the tiny house appendix that was passed? So internationally, it was for the ICC that oversees the building code. There's been an appendix that actually passed at the national level called Appendix Q, and now they're referring to it as the Tiny House Appendix. And any states or towns that choose to adopt that can now build homes with tiny little staircases, lower ceiling heights, little small bathrooms, and go under 400 square feet and still meet the building code, okay? So that does exist. And manufactured homes, like you know, I showed first, of course, multifamily homes where homes are all attached together. But then there's single-family homes, and then we say tiny single-family. So this would be for any town that actually is able to adopt that Appendix Q in the coming years. I hear only a couple have done it so far. It's very, very new. And cycles for building codes only come up less than once a year in a lot of states and a lot of towns. But I think in the coming years, we're going to see a lot more towns saying, yes, you can build a tiny home that's under 400 square feet on a foundation, theoretically, because of the taxes and stuff that you mentioned, not next to a giant 4,000 square foot home, because you're going to bring down the value of that person's home. But honestly, the reason I didn't do this, and I could have done it in New Hampshire in some towns that don't have zoning, you can build a home of any size, and you can draw the floor plans yourself. That's what my parents always did. We picked a town with no zoning and build a home, any home we wanted to. They'll still inspect it when you're done. Yeah, so you just got to be careful about where you put it. So manufactured, does everybody kind of know what manufactured homes are? They come up, they show up with axles, the axles are removed, and they're put on some sort of a stationary foundation after they're parked. We all know what RVs are. We've seen them. They've been around for many, many years. They're meant for seasonal use. In some towns go as far as to say you're only allowed to sleep in an RV up to a certain number of days or a certain number of months per year. I know in this area and in Massachusetts as a whole, most of Massachusetts will not allow you to sleep in your RVs outside of October to May. That's why you see most RV parks, not all, there's a couple that are grandfathered in, but most RV parks, like I park in an RV park, are only open from May to October. So the reason I picked New Hampshire is because they have year-round RV parks. Massachusetts doesn't, or I would have stayed in Massachusetts. And then we have the tiny houses on wheels, you know, so these are vehicles. These have to follow National Highway Traffic Safety Administration when they're going down the road, unless, like you mentioned, we get a special permit or we get a special CDL driver or somebody we're hiring that in some states it requires even police escorts if you get over a certain width on the highways, okay? But these are vehicles that go down the road, and they have to comply with that law. They have to have a license plate, or you're going to get pulled over by a police officer. In some states, you get audited in weigh stations for these types of vehicles and RVs, depending what size you are. So they have to meet the limit that, like you mentioned, with the trailer limits. Mine weighs 14,000 pounds, and I need at least an F-250 to pull me down the road. And they're really cute. I mean, come on, RVs are adorable. Most people are not living in RVs year-round, but those of us like myself who do, this is the main entrance of my RV park when I first pulled it in there 2 years ago, and I've stayed in the same parking spot for the past couple years, okay? My only bill that I actually have right now is my parking spot, which includes my water and my sewer, and then I have to pay electricity on top of that. Okay, that's really my only bills at all, because I own the house. And many of us who have tiny houses do own houses. But But I just have a couple slides I'm going to go through really quick on, when you're driving down the road, it's like going through a hurricane. It's like being in hurricane force winds with a home, 55, 60 miles an hour. Obviously, you're not going to drive it in the ocean, but I've driven mine through the rain and snow. There was one hill we were going up, and the truck wasn't in the four-wheel drive, and this house comes sliding back toward me. And I was just like, no! Like, it's like you don't want your house to kill you, but you also don't want your house to crash and break, right? So yeah, see, there's a license plate there. See, I'm registered in Connecticut, actually. And, I did have a tree, actually. I should have brought a picture of that, but I did have a tree fall down next to my tiny house last year in the RV park. And I was like, boom! I was like, what is this loud noise? But 5 feet different, it would have fallen directly on my house. I went to a bunch of trade shows when I first finished it about 3 years ago. So it's been through the big, what do they say, the Big Dig Tunnel. That's it right there on Seaport Ave, or Seaport Boulevard rather, downtown. And when I was a little kid and lived in an RV park, these are all the forces that all homes are up against. But RVs in particular, you're parked within very close proximity of the RVs next to you. So I use non-combustible materials for my tiny house, knowing that there was a fire in one of the RV parks that I grew up in, because I didn't want my whole house to turn into this, like a bunch of, rubbish. So my RV park doesn't quite look like this. It's actually right on a big lake in Brookline, New Hampshire. Again, I'm happy to give the address, to anybody who wants to come out there. You're welcome to come. The RV park owners are very happy to take on other tiny houses if you guys are looking for a parking spot. We have a couple guys that had buses converted to RVs and stuff, or to tiny houses rather. And I just have just a parking spot in that park. I used an app called RV Parky to find a parking spot. So if you're thinking about going tiny or downsizing with all the information you've learned tonight, it's very easy to find a parking spot and just interview these RV park owners. There's a lot of apps. This is just one of them that I loved. But going in person to ask these people, can I park here with my tiny house? So I grew up first we had this RV, then that one, then we had a big 40-footer in the end, and I was like, yeah, 40-footer for the four of us. And then finally my parents finished their last house, and I graduated high school and moved out. So I was like, great. So they didn't mean for me to grow up in RVs, but that's what ended up happening because they kept upsizing. We barely lived for a year or so in each one of these before, and then I ended up moving out. So. But here's pictures from inside the RV. So we were a normal family, not weird. Obviously it's me and my little brother. And we grew up together building, like I said, the homes that I mentioned earlier. There's our first tiny house, by the way. It's a clubhouse. Yeah, so that was our first tiny house. And in my yearbook, I just found this a couple months ago. In my yearbook, somebody was making fun of the RV I lived in, and they drew a house on wheels in 1996 and said something about come visit you at your house or whatever. And I was just like looking at this like a couple months ago going, what the Anyway, so my brother and I, built my house together. I could not have done it without him. I had the money, he had the muscles, and he usually drove it anytime we went anywhere. So this was what it looked like a couple weeks ago, and then I ripped out these cabinets, and I got another picture. I ripped out these cabinets here and made this one big open room because I realized, 20 feet is way too much storage. I didn't think it was going to be enough storage with my Amazon addiction and my TJ Maxx addiction and all that stuff. I started out with a Murphy bed that folded down, and now I just have a futon that unfolds. So mine is one level with two means of egress, because I think if a space is smaller, you got to be able to get out of it faster if something bad happens. Plus, if I'm sleeping in bed and somebody tries to break in, I can just go and just like bounce out the door and get out, a lot faster out of either door, right? I keep a fire extinguisher at either end of the house in case something goes wrong. I've got security cameras on the doors on the outside, the cameras inside. If anybody wants to dial up and see my house on the camera afterwards, I can do that from my phone anytime. I do have a tiny bathroom, but that's a regular 3-foot shower, and I have a dishwasher, washer, dryer. So I tried to fit as much, I wasn't willing to give up any of my luxuries. But I used all non-toxic building materials because it is a tiny space and you really do need fresh air. Non-combustible, so it's all fire rated. I used metal framing because cars are metal, not wood. And this is a vehicle, so I framed the house out of metal. And everything runs on electric, no propane or gas, and it meets or actually exceeds the energy code required for a normal house. If you're really creative with the building materials, it's not the stuff you buy at Home Depot or Lowe's, it's all commercial materials. But if you're really creative with the building materials, you can easily meet all the codes and requirements. And now that Appendix Q is out, even the houses on wheels can meet the codes. And there's me on the porch. And I did mention I have incoming water, electric, and cable, an outgoing drain. Those are my hookups. And then I just have a couple photos of the inside of the house, including, that's ripped out, so including the fireplace that it's fake fireplace, obviously, but because with my history with all the fears of fire and everything, it's a digital LED fireplace, so that room's a lot bigger now. There's my porch, and I do spend a lot of time outdoors, so I have a big patio in the back. And actually, yeah, if you guys wait a couple weeks till it actually starts getting warm out, you can come over and have some drinks. So, no, seriously, I have you didn't see in one of the pictures, I have a bar in there too, actually. That's like, you make your priority list, like what's important to you, place to put your TJ Maxx clothes, bar, and, TV. But, just a couple really quick slides at the very end is just things that you guys can do today, even if you don't downsize, even if you don't, have a tiny house. Things you can do to make your life a lot simpler and easier and more fun is just get rid of all the stuff you're not using or donate it if somebody else can use it. And if you have a smaller trash can, the more often you empty the trash, the more you realize how much waste you're going through. So there's ways to avoid the waste. Get rid of all the paper. Go digital with everything you can, even your books and everything. Have all your shelves and drawers be open so you can see everything, and shop around the perimeter of a grocery store so you have fresh food. You're not storing anything in cabinets. The only things in my cabinets are spices and coffee, but everything else lives in the refrigerator. Okay, it's all fresh food and stuff. But I do have an Amazon Prime addiction, as I mentioned, so you can still have your Amazon Prime. So anyway, that's the end of mine.
If you all had pieces of paper in case you wanted to send up questions, but if I have one that I'll begin with, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So you can decide among yourselves who's going to answer this. What feature, utility, or idea initially that you underestimated has proven to be the most advantageous? So what surprised you?
For me, I mentioned the metal framing on my house. If I ever did another tiny house, I would never, ever, ever do it again without the metal framing. I have drywall for the inside of my walls, just like every building. So I would say, to me, almost all the building materials are metal. I have no wood inside my tiny house. What you see that looks wood in the picture is actually not really wood.
I have a wood stove. And the wood stove means that all year round, as I come and go from our office building / sleeping space, that I, any time of the year I can just gather stuff up and heat it up toasty with the stick-built building. It's really cool. I love the wood stove passionately. And it heats water, and it remoisturizes the air when you put a little, something on top, and because the heat, of course, evaporates the moisture, and it's just really neat.
And my love of light, I have a 4-foot wide sliding door on the side that's glass. My front door is glass. I have a window and a skylight in that 185 feet. And I get to watch the stars at night. And I get beautiful light, and I watch all those animals that play in the woods around me.
All different. So, questions? Yes.
Maybe the financial investment that yours ended up?
Happy to share. 21 feet long for the house, so it's 20 feet inside. I didn't exceed the 8.5-foot requirement, and I'm 12.5 foot high. And I spent $60,000 on my house, and I had about 20 grand donated on top of that worth of materials because I was in trade shows. So my home is just building materials alone over $80,000.
Okay.
And it's 150 square feet. I pay $600 a month for my parking spot. And then about $50 to $125 on top of that for electricity. That's it.
Other questions? Yes.
Where does Gloucester stand with regard to this Appendix Q?
Where does Gloucester stand?
Yeah, is Gloucester adopting it?
Can I answer that? Can I?
Yes.
I'm on the city council, and that's a great question. I'm Val Gilman, And we have not yet looked at that, but I will tell you that I did put a council order in last summer on tiny houses. And I had a very productive meeting with our community development, now our planning director, Greg Catamatori. And it was joined by Adam Kukru, who's our Veterans Affairs person, as well as former Councilor Joe Orlando. And I wanted to explore this. And we did have a really beneficial conversation about this. And we talked about some of the challenges in Gloucester, looking at some of our land size and our current zoning, and that maybe we could fit it into an accessory unit at a current zoned house. But then it ran into the issue of betterments for sewer. But when I talked to the folks in Nantucket, I talked to some of the selectmen at a meeting this summer at the MMA conference, because they did a presentation on this, and I said, those are the experts, so let me talk to them. They developed some pretty creative ways of financing that's in their zoning, with a descending way to finance different plots on larger spots. And they also had integrated into an affordable housing model, where some of the betterments, the sewerage hookups, were part of affordable housing with grants from the Affordable Housing Trust. So I'm extraordinarily interested in all this, and it's something that you know, I also chair planning and development, and I'm very, very interested. That's why I'm here, and I want you to know that I'm going to explore this this new code, and see if we can keep the conversation going, because we also did a workshop in Lanesville, and there was a group of about 20 folks that loved this idea. So I think it's pretty hot, and I would just love to see us consider it. There are challenges, things like the wheels and how they need to go up, because we have, you know, bands of mobile homes. There's all these little things, but we had the initial conversation, and I'm just absolutely amazed how many people are here, and it's really good stuff. So I'm on the website, Val Gilman, V. Gilman. Let me know if you're interested in looking into this more, and I'm not afraid to take these initiatives if there's interest, and kind of look into the zoning and how it could all fit together. So too much said, but you guys are awesome. Thank you.
In the back, sir.
I'm curious about tiny houses on water, and maybe like in Amsterdam, the idea has already been.
Tiny houses on water. You look like you know.
They exist. It's a thing. Like, there's a lot of people that do it, actually, on lakes and in the ocean. And I looked in the very beginning when I was building my house about putting it on the water. There's a lot more annual maintenance and pulling it up out in the barnacles, and there's a lot more cost than just the expensive slips. All the slips I looked at, even down in Boston, are like over $1,000 a month just for that slip. And then you're only allowed to be in certain parts of either the lakes or the ocean during certain times of the year, but they're all over the place. There's a lot of them. They're legal. Many people already live in them year-round. And they mostly have the incinerator toilet, just like I do. The incinerator toilets came from the boating world.
How about that one that, as you come into Gloucester, there's a house that's usually there in the summer? What is going on with that?
So was that clear? The question was, can we have houseboats? And evidently, the ones that we do have are grandfathered in, and no more houseboats.
Just for this area.
Here.
How toxic is non-toxic? How long does it take for the house to cure? And does it give off off-gassing they call it? You know, the glues and all that?
The question is about the wood curing, off-gassing, having a safe environment, environmentally safe environment. Yeah. Well, we can choose to use, to not use off-gassing materials. We can choose not to finish any of the interior wood, for example. We can choose cedar over pine. Cedar actually has properties that are insect repelling. We don't have to use adhesives in cabinets and floors. So there are a lot of ways to avoid a lot of those things, and that becomes part of the plan. The thing is, a lot of people, as they strive to find something very affordable, doing things this way is often more expensive. But with my degree in specifically, sustainability, green building materials, this is what we like to do. It's just a little cost prohibitive for a lot of young people who are inquiring. Most often it's younger people, by the way.
And I'd like to add to that, Green Guard certification is a good certification to look at for an entity that exists, a third party that does testing for building materials. So this is any building material. Some products that are sold in Lowe's and Home Depot are Green Guard certified, and they either have no or low off-gassing that occurs, or no VOCs, as they say. You guys need to understand that wood has naturally occurring formaldehyde in it, so that's not a good chemical to have, but that actually is in natural wood. It's going to be, if you use wood, there is going to be off-gassing. It's just about how small that actually is.
The other thing you can do is, after you put in your furniture, you turn the heat up very high and you bake the inside of your house. I do this in office buildings to clear out all the chemicals that come in with partitions and furniture and carpeting and walls. But if we bake that space at a very high temperature for about 3 days and run a HEPA filter at the same time, it's going to clear most of the chemicals out very quickly, because your furniture, the lighting, all of these things are going to come in with chemicals as part of them.
In the back, over there.
I was curious, with tiny houses on wheels, like, do you if you're not planning on driving it around regularly, like maybe finding a place and parking it, indefinitely, whatever, like, do you recommend like owning one of these big trucks that is able to transport it, or would you recommend, paying to get it transported to you and parked where you need it, and then if you decide once a year or once every few years to go somewhere, paying, versus like buying a big truck?
Tracy. Tracy has an exceptionally lightweight approach to her tiny house, using the metal and versus the stick built. So, by no means, I think we recommend having a big beast of a truck, because when you unhitch, that becomes the truck you use to go shopping and everything else, right? So no, honestly, what we recommend is that people simply hire, get a bid for a towing service and have them take that place to place. On average, honestly, people don't move too much, maybe just once or twice in their whole life.
I've moved my vehicle. Every time I move it, it costs about $300. And there's several different drivers that I've hired to do that, and all pricing is all about the same. As long as they're driving under a couple hours, they want you to cover tolls and pay about $300. So it's, rather than paying $300 a week in gas, you know what I mean? So.
Did any one of you live in a large home and then move into a small one? And what were the physical changes and adaptability? I mean, how did your life change?
I have lived in everything from a 13-room Queen Anne Victorian to my 185 square foot house. The changes are ones I welcomed. With each time I downsize, my life got simpler. In the home I lived in Medfield, one of the reasons I wanted to move out of it is I had used it for my children to grow up in and all their friends. I had used it when they left. I put a border upstairs so that the space got utilized well. I moved my office home. So I was shrinking my actual living space within the same house and getting used to smaller and smaller. My decision was very simple. I wanted to spend not my physical energy, my spiritual energy, and my economic energy all as I hit my 70s, I was all a little less than it was before. I want to spend that energy, which to me is my abundance. True abundance is for me using those resources in the ways I want to. My home, as small as it is, fits me just right. It's sort of like living in a tree house because it's so connected to the outside. It functions really well. It takes me at maximum 10 to 15 minutes to clean top to bottom, including the bathroom. I don't have a lot of stuff, so I don't do a lot of laundry. I don't have extra stuff. I put together a package that's out over there about how to change your attitude so that you have a different feeling about space. We have in our society, because it is consumer-based and it's a consumer engine, television sells you a lot. The first thing I did when I decided to downsize was get rid of my television and stop shopping at malls. I found I didn't want nearly as much stuff afterwards. Then I began giving it away, and I liked in my space the airiness I suddenly got. That feeling like, oh, I don't have so much to dust. I don't have so much to clean. I get up in the morning, I take a quick shower, I gather my backpack, and I head out the door. I visit with people, I do my work. There's time for everything. I spend a month in Peru every year, a week with different family members. I'm planning a trip with my oldest grandson to Ireland in August. And I have the funds and the means to do that because when I walk out my door, the only thing that's on, then I can actually switch it off, is the hot water heater. That's it.
Yes.
Joanne, is your house a static house then? Are you
My
hooked
house
up to
is static.
You hooked up to the water system and you pay real estate? It looked like it was attached to another house.
There's 3 feet between my house and the house next door, which was, my house is the outbuilding on a property originally. The house in front of it was the carriage house, and the house in front of that is a turn-of-the-century house that they've converted to 2 condos. So I have dedicated land there, but I have someone to plow and shovel my walk and mow my grass for $50 a month. That's my home maintenance fee. My house is heated with a Mitsubishi unit through air. It's both heated and cooled that way. It's small enough, however, that once it's warm for a long time. And my total electric bill in the middle of the winter, which is my stove, my refrigerator, my heating and cooling, heating my hot water, was $140. Much of the seasons, the shoulder seasons, it's $60. And that's what I was looking for. So my economic resources can go to the things I love doing.
And you own the land?
My home is actually a condo setup, but I own my own home. I own its maintenance. I own what I do to it. And I have dedicated property on that land. So there are essentially 4 people living on the whole lot. Mine is the tiniest space. The next house next to me is about 700 square feet.
Yes. Sir.
I'd like to know if there's any solar involved, hot water tanks or heat built into the units at any point?
Okay, the question is there any solar involved with the hot water tank and just overall electricity, heating water? Okay, yeah. Combining technologies is a really neat way to go. and often kind of required. So in order to reduce the load, what we require for electricity, what we normally do is we have as much as we can rely on propane, actually. So by relying on propane, though it's not a renewable source, it does store rather well. We can have the stovetop, the hot water on demand, okay? We can have the heat itself, wall-mounted propane heater, normally vented, and that wall mount requires very little space around it, PS. And then solar, even a really small system, becomes so valuable just to power up, for example, LED lights, a laptop computer. If cleverly done and you have enough panels, even if it's a ground mount, because remember, people aren't really moving with the tiny houses on wheels, they move in someplace, you can really satisfy everything just by combining a few technologies, including water catchment to catch your water, maybe a wood stove, so it really is kind of neat that way. And a lot of people are seeking to be off-grid, by the way. So we try to achieve that, to the degree that people can afford to do that. Solar can be a little more expensive.
I had quotes done very early on for solar, and everything that I have is electric because my brother's an electrician, but also because I intended everything to eventually be on solar. And the surface area of my roof being 26 feet long and at a 412 pitch the way it is on purpose just so I could put the panels right on the roof. And they said all the companies I talked to were very happy to sell me solar panels, but I would need an actual docking station that was about 4 or 5 times the size of my house for me to live off. Yeah, panels don't generate as much power as we probably think they do. If we're not net metering back into the grid, we need batteries to store that power. In the Northeast, it's not an ideal place for solar. We see a lot more wind up here because there, right now. I mean, we're like in the middle of the winter and it's been cloudy for months. It feels like, but it's true. We're not generating enough power, and those batteries are very heavy. So if the batteries are not going to live on the ground, then they need to live on the trailer. And then there's all this research about how close do you want to sleep next to batteries. I don't know, but anyway. So yeah, I would love to get it one day, though.
The other thing is, if you're doing this because you want to be kind to the environment, you can use electric, but buy it from sources that are wind and renewable.
Just curious if, as a base model, do people use freight containers?
Yeah, gentleman's asking about using shipping containers, but the metal is a wonderful conductivity of the freezing cold, though. And so you end up having a completely subsystem of structure within these containers. So it's interesting. It is interesting, but it's not something that, wouldn't be our first choice.
In the back?
It's a lot more expensive than you think it is, by the way. I have a friend that builds buildings out of shipping containers entirely, like the box office in Providence, where they're all stacked up together. And there is thermal bridging, as she's saying, that comes from the outside through to the inside, but I used coatings I sprayed the inside of all the metal to help prevent most of that thermal bridging. So there's technologies in place, but the wiring and plumbing and electrical, all your infrastructure that you need, that you would put in any normal structure, doesn't play very well nicely with the structure of containers. That's why you don't see more of them.
In the back?
There are 2 resources. I wonder how people only have limited time, so I'm giving 2 resources. It used to be called Build Boston once a year in Boston, and they have threads of different, even combined technologies. And some of the smaller companies that don't have a big name yet have some wonderful proof of concept models at that place, and the information is available after the conference onto their websites. Okay.
She's offering Build Boston.
Yeah, the name may have changed this last year or 2. I used to go every year.
Okay.
And so the issues of even, for example, water purification is a big one that hasn't been mentioned at all.
Okay, so there are all sorts of resources that people could use if they're interested in tiny houses through Build Boston. So there's examples at this show that would be really nicely placed in a tiny house. Thank you.
Okay. Other question in the back?
What kind of insulation do each of your houses use?
Insulation can range in price, so we go with what the customer would like to do. The greener insulation tends to be more expensive, more eco-friendly. Honestly, on average, we're just asked to put in the less caustic green batten. I mean, the purple, pink, yeah, it's pink. It is so pink fiberglass, which, you know, that they have a sort of eco version of that. Frankly, the blown in, there's cellulose, there's all sorts of really great green products. It tends to be a little more expensive and sometimes not problematic at all. They work really well. But one that's very caustic, even if the word soy is attached to it, is the spray-in foam. It is super caustic. The argument being, big deal, you seal up the walls, it's in there. But, you know, so we actually, even though it does a better job of insulating, that foam does, we end up defaulting to the pink stuff.
So my spray-in closed-cell foam that's in my walls, I use closed-cell instead of open-cell because it's more rigid and you get a higher R value. Actually, like every type of spray-in foam, like she's saying, you have to wear special suits to put it in, but it dries within 3 days, and then there's no off-gassing after that, whether you seal up the walls or not. So there's a lot of materials that are out there like that. My siding is made out of foam. So you look at it blue and you go, oh, she painted the walls, but it's actually a system called outsolation. It's used to be called EFIS back in the 80s, and it's actually foam that has layers of mesh and plaster on it, and then it has the colors actually come out of the bucket just like that. It's like a finish that's troweled on. So that's how I'm able to exceed the R value with walls that are only 6 inches thick.
Other questions? Well, thank you very much. There's plenty of information on the table in the back. If you want more information from, about the appendix for the International Residential Code, leave your name and email address, and we will send you copies of that. There are some states that have developed an entire code for tiny houses, and we'll send you information on that. And if you have other questions that you want to ask, feel free to come up and say hello. Thank you very much.